They laughed when they saw him kneading dough in the back room of the community center. A broad-shouldered man with peppered hair and a stern face. Yet there he was, elbows deep in flour, humming softly while shaping loaves like a gentle artist. The teenagers passing by snickered. "Hey, tough guy." One of them sneered, "You joining a bake-off or something?" Another chimed in, "Look at this guy, acting like a grandma. What's next? Knitting scarves." The man didn't flinch. He just kept kneading. The smell of warm yeast and fresh rosemary began to overpower the sting of their mockery. But they didn't stop. Not until the mayor showed up. Not until the truth came out. Not until every single person in that small town stood in stunned silence as they realized who he really was. His name was Frank Donovan, 61 years old. Lived alone on the edge of town in a modest home with a garden full of herbs. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he volunteered to bake bread for the local shelter, never missing a single shift, rain or shine. Most people thought he was just a lonely old man trying to stay busy. They were wrong. The teasing started that Monday morning. A group of high school boys, waiting for basketball practice to begin, saw him rolling a cart of flour bags from his truck. Tall, muscular, a faded Marine Corps tattoo peeking out from under his rolled-up sleeves. He didn't fit their idea of a baker. "Yo," said Jamal, the tallest of the group. "You trying out for America's Next Top Baker?" Frank glanced at them, one brow arched. "You boys want to help carry these in, or just stand there wasting air?" They snorted and walked away. Inside, Frank set up his space with the precision of a surgeon. Measuring cups aligned, pans greased, dough rising under warm towels. As he mixed ingredients, he whispered to himself, 2-1 ratio, like back in base camp Alpha. Don't overwork the flour, or the men'll complain again. Those weren't just loaves. They were blueprints, memory maps, each one tied to a place, a face story. The next day, the mocking escalated. A girl posted a video of Frank dusting flour on a tray. She captioned it, "Mr. Tough Guy making cupcakes #soft hands." It went viral locally. The kids laughed. The adults chuckled. Some even whispered behind his back, "Why does he even bother? Probably thinks he's in some Hallmark movie." But that Wednesday, something changed. A power outage struck the town mid-afternoon. The storm knocked out electricity, flooded the roads, and closed the main grocery store. By nightfall, the shelter was full. Over 50 people, young and old, cold and hungry. The staff was panicking. The backup generator had failed, and they had no hot food. Then Frank walked in, carrying crates of dough he'd prepped that morning. "You got gas ovens?" he asked the frazzled shelter manager. "Susan." She nodded. "Still working." "Why?" Frank rolled up his sleeves. "Then we've got bread to bake." He worked through the night. No complaints, no breaks, just the rhythm of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. At 3 a.m., the entire building smelled of garlic focaccia and cinnamon rolls. The shelter guests clapped when the first trays came out. Children squealed, elders cried. By morning, word had spread. On Thursday, the mayor showed up unannounced with a news crew in tow. Cameras flashed as Frank pulled a tray of braided challah from the oven. The same kids who laughed now watched from the doorway, jaws slack. "Mr. Donovan," the mayor began, "can we talk about your past?" Frank sighed, wiped his hands, and faced the crowd. "You want to know why I bake?" he asked. They nodded. He motioned toward the far wall. "Back in 1985, I was deployed with the 1 Battalion, 7th Marines. Desert conditions. Supplies scarce. My unit hadn't had hot food in weeks. Morale was breaking. Our cook went down with heat stroke. Command needed someone who could improvise. So I stepped in." He pointed to a scar on his forearm. "Burned myself on a makeshift oven made from ammo, crates, and a metal sheet. But I figured out how to bake flatbread using engine oil, heat, and patience. Fed 140 men every day. Used dried herbs from rations. Stole salt packets from enemy compounds. The men said my bread tasted like home. The mayor asked softly, "How long did you do it?" 8 years, Frank said. I fed units in desert war zones, jungle outposts, and mountain bunkers. Food saved lives. It gave men hope, made them believe they'd survive long enough to go home. A cameraman asked, "Why didn't you ever talk about it?" Frank looked down at his calloused hands. "I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because hungry men die faster. I bake now because people are still hungry." Different battlefield. Silence fell. Jamal stepped forward. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, sir. We didn't know." Frank nodded. "Now you do." From that day on, the tone changed. Kids started asking if they could help. The basketball team showed up every Tuesday to unload flour. Parents donated ingredients. The same community that once mocked now stood in line to learn. Frank became a local legend, not because he baked the best bread, though he did, but because he taught them something deeper. One Saturday, the town hosted a festival. They called it Honor Through Bread. Frank stood on stage, apron dusted with flour, beside a banner that read, "Baker of Battalions." Veterans from nearby towns came, some with photos of Frank from years past. One man limped up to the mic and said, "This man saved my life not with a rifle, but with a loaf of sourdough. When we thought we were forgotten, he reminded us we weren't." Frank's eyes glistened. "I just did my duty," he said. "Now I do what I can with what I know. That's all any man can do." And from then on, whenever someone asked why the bread at the shelter tasted like strength, or why kids now said yes, chef, with a salute, they'd be told the story of Frank Donovan, the man who was teased for baking, until the world found out he fed entire battalions. The crowd erupted into applause that didn't end for minutes. Frank tried to wave them off, uncomfortable with the attention, but the mayor stepped forward and raised a hand. "Let them thank you, Frank," she said softly. "You gave this town more than bread. You gave it back its soul." From the sidelines, Susan, the shelter manager, wiped her eyes and whispered to the local reporter beside her, "I've worked in community services for 20 years. I've never seen anything like what he did that night. He didn't just feed them, he gave them dignity." After the ceremony, children surrounded Frank with drawings of bread loaves and little soldier figurines. One girl, barely 6, handed him a picture she drew in crayon. "You're a bread hero," she said shyly. Frank knelt, took the drawing with calloused hands, and smiled. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more than you know." But behind the celebration was a deeper story. One few people knew. Only Susan had glimpsed pieces of it in fragments. Frank let slip over the years. That night, as the cleanup crew packed up the festival tables, she found him sitting alone behind the community center, a cup of black coffee in hand. She sat beside him. "You all right?" He nodded, just remembering. "Want to talk about it?" He stared at the stars for a long time. There was a boy, 19. Looked like he should have been in college, not carrying a rifle. He had nightmares, couldn't sleep, wouldn't talk. But he liked helping me cook. One night, after a bad firefight, I found him in the mess tent rolling dough. I asked him why. He said, "When I bake, I forget I'm scared." Frank swallowed hard. A week later, he stepped on a mine. Susan put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Frank." He nodded. "I bake now for him, for the others who didn't come home. It's not just bread, it's memory." The next week, a letter arrived at the town hall. It was from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. It read, "In recognition of Staff Sergeant Frank Donovan's service, not only in active combat, but for the critical support role he played as a field chef, improvising, nourishing, and saving lives, we award him the Distinguished Service Medal. May his story remind America that service takes many forms." The town held another ceremony, this time at the War Memorial. Frank didn't want it. "I don't need medals," he told the mayor. "I need yeast, flour, and a warm oven." But the mayor insisted, "It's not just for you, it's for us, for the kids, for the veterans. They need to see this." He wore his old Marine jacket that day. Didn't fit like it used to, but it carried history, as the medal was pinned to his chest. He glanced out at the crowd. Among them stood every kid who ever laughed at him. Now they stood at attention, silent, respectful. Afterward, one of them approached Jamal. He was holding a tray. On it, a lopsided but proud-looking loaf of bread. "I baked this," he said. "Used your recipe. I still don't get it all, but I tried." Frank took the bread, nodded slowly, then looked Jamal in the eye. "You did more than try. Son, you showed up." From that moment, Frank's baking classes overflowed. People came not just to learn baking, but to hear his stories. He shared tales of field kitchens in jungles, of boiling broth while bullets flew overhead, of men crying over a slice of cornbread because it tasted like their grandmother's. Each class ended the same way. "Feed people like you, love them," Frank said, "because someday that might be the only love they feel." The community center expanded its kitchen, naming it Donovan's Hearth. Veterans joined to teach, and the space became more than a kitchen. It became a sanctuary, a place where dough was more than food. It was connection, healing, and history. But not everything was peaceful. One morning, a man named Brian, gruff, middle-aged, and bitter, entered the kitchen during class. He stood in the back, arms folded. Frank noticed but didn't call him out. After class, Brian cornered him. "I don't get it," he said. "Why you? Why does this town worship a baker?" Frank studied him. "You served." Brian nodded reluctantly. "I was a medic. Afghanistan. Came back with nothing. No job, no respect. People look at you like a hero. Me." They crossed the street. Frank nodded slowly. "Then come bake with me." Brian blinked. "What?" "Come back tomorrow. Bring your hands. I'll bring the flour." Brian did. He never left. Within weeks, he was laughing again, teaching kids how to roll tortillas. He told stories, dark ones, brave ones. The kitchen gave him something the world forgot to: purpose. Soon, Donovan's Hearth launched a program, Bake to Heal. Veterans trained to become bakers. Some opened shops, some stayed, but every single one said the same thing: "Frank saved me." Not with therapy, with bread. The story reached national news. A segment aired on a Sunday morning program. Frank, looking uncomfortable in front of the camera, simply said, "I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who couldn't leave hungry people behind. War taught me that. Peace reminds me every day." Letters poured in, from widows, from soldiers, from strangers. One letter stood out. It read, "My son died in combat. He said a man named Donovan taught him how to make flatbread before a mission. That he laughed for the first time in months. That night, he died. But that bread was the last thing he talked about. Thank you." Frank cried when he read it. He framed the letter, hung it above his oven. Years passed. Frank grew slower. His hands didn't knead as they once did. But every class, he was there, a chair beside the oven, watching, guiding, smiling. Then, one winter, the town awoke to find the bakery closed. A note taped to the door: "Gone to rest my bones. Keep feeding people. Love them through your cooking. You know how." Frank Donovan passed peacefully in his sleep, a heart worn full. At his funeral, soldiers came from every state. The governor attended. Even the president sent a wreath. But it was the children's drawings, loaves, and medals, and smiles that filled his casket. On his tombstone, etched in careful letters, were the words he once whispered over hot bread in a storm-torn shelter: "Feed people like you, love them." And the town never forgot, because a man once teased for baking turned out to be the one who taught them all what strength really meant. The weeks after Frank Donovan's funeral felt heavy, like the whole town was moving through molasses. Even the wind seemed quieter, as if paying respects. The kitchen at Donovan's Hearth stayed dark for a few days. No scent of rosemary or garlic. No warm loaves stacked in baskets by the door. The regulars, volunteers, veterans, kids from the high school stood outside in silence, unsure of what to do. Then Jamal stepped forward. He was older now, almost 20, in community college, but always returned on weekends to help Frank. With trembling hands, he unlocked the front door. He didn't build this place for it to stay empty, he said. They filed in, one by one. Susan wiped down the counters. Brian preheated the ovens. The mayor arrived with boxes of donated flour. And when the first batch of loaves went in, someone played a recording Frank had once made during a veteran's cooking session, his gravelly voice narrating a recipe, then telling a story about making biscuits on a tank hood in Kandahar. They cried, but they baked. Each loaf that came out that day bore a hand-press symbol, a capital D with 3 lines beneath it, like rising heat. It was Jamal's idea. Stands for Donovan, he said, and for feeding souls. Months passed, and Donovan's hearth thrived in new ways. A young woman named Carly, a culinary school graduate and daughter of a retired Army sergeant, stepped in to manage daily operations. She brought new recipes, but every lesson started the same way Frank used to begin. Tell me who you're cooking for. Imagine their face. Now cook like it's your last meal with them. Veteran suicide rates were high in the region. The town council, inspired by Frank's legacy, approved funding for a Bake-to-Heal retreat weekend programs where struggling vets could learn to cook, share stories, and find fellowship. Word spread, and veterans began driving in from states away. One man arrived from Colorado, scars visible across his neck. He didn't speak the first 2 days. On the third, he made banana bread and whispered, "I haven't felt this human in years." The shelter across the street, once struggling, now served fresh bread daily. Local cafes began displaying signs, "Bread by Donovan's Hearth." Profits from those loaves funded meals for the homeless. Kids who once laughed now ran a weekly bake sale to support wounded veteran housing. Frank's teachings, simple, profound, wove themselves into every layer of town life. But the most striking transformation was Jamal. Once a brash teenager, now he stood tall, confident, kind. He got a tattoo on his forearm, the same Marine Corps insignia Frank bore. Surrounded by a swirl of wheat stalks, he led school workshops, often starting with, "I used to think real men didn't bake. Then I met someone who showed me what real strength looks like." One day, during a veterans event, a gray-haired general took the podium. "I didn't serve with Frank Donovan," he said, "but I served because of men like him, quiet giants, builders, not just warriors." His story reminded this nation that courage isn't always loud. It's sometimes just the sound of bread rising at dawn. On the 5-year anniversary of Frank's death, the town unveiled a bronze statue outside Donovan's hearth. It showed Frank kneeling beside an oven, offering a loaf to a young soldier. The plaque read, "In war, he fed the forgotten. In peace, he nourished the broken. Through bread, he gave the world hope." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the townspeople held a candlelight vigil. Children clutched loaves. Veterans wore aprons over their uniforms. One by one, they stepped up to the microphone, sharing memories. A former homeless man, once addicted and alone, said, "Frank didn't ask what I did. He just asked if I was hungry. Then he handed me cornbread and said, 'Welcome home,'" Carly said. "He didn't teach recipes. He taught us to heal." Jamal stepped up last. His voice cracked. "He never told me he loved me. But every loaf was a letter, every kneaded dough, a message. You matter, stay strong. I never had a father, but I had Frank Donovan." Silence fell. Then someone started singing, a soft, broken version of Amazing Grace. The whole town joined in. And for a moment, it felt like Frank was there behind the ovens, arms crossed, that small, rare smile on his lips. The world would forget many names, but not his. Not the man who was teased for baking, then remembered as the one who fed not just battalions, but a broken world desperate for warmth, for healing, for bread. Because love, in its simplest form, sometimes comes in a crusted loaf, shared with trembling hands and open hearts. And Frank Donovan loved this world more than it would ever understand. Years rolled on, but Frank Donovan's legacy only grew stronger with time. Children who once sat on countertops watching their parents bake under his guidance grew up and returned with kids of their own. "That's where Mr. Donovan stood," they'd say, pointing to the dented wooden floorboard by the oven. "Right there. He showed me how to roll dough without fear, how to season stew with memory." Every corner of the hearth held a story. The left window bore a crack no one ever fixed. Frank had once leaned out of it to toss stale bread to a flock of crows, joking they were his first customers of the day. That tale became legend. Kids called the birds Frank's flock. A mural was painted above the door, Frank in his apron, arms wide, welcoming everyone with warm bread and a warmer heart. One spring, the Department of Defense invited Donovan's Hearth to cater a memorial event at Arlington. The team, Carly, Jamal, Bryan, and several others traveled together, loaded with trays of rolls, pies, and biscuits made with the exact ratios Frank had drilled into them. As they served hundreds of veterans and families, a silence fell over the field. Tears mingled with bites. One elderly man, seated alone, stood and saluted the bread. "To the man who fed our sons when no one else could," he whispered. Back in town, Frank's home had been preserved as a community museum. Volunteers curated every room, the garden filled with herbs he used, the tiny shelf lined with spices from countries most people couldn't even pronounce, the wall of letters from soldiers and families. His bedroom remained untouched, neat, sparse, the quilt folded tight. On the nightstand sat a photo, Frank, young and sunburned, arms slung around a fellow Marine, both grinning, cheeks streaked with flour and soot. Susan, who'd since retired from the shelter but never from its mission, often led tours. She would pause at the kitchen door and say, "This is where he wept once." After baking cinnamon bread, I asked why. He said, "It smelled like home. I didn't know. I missed it until now." Veteran chefs who trained at the Hearth went on to start Donovan kitchens in other towns, small spaces built on Frank's teachings. Nourish without question. Love through food. Serve with humility. Each kitchen featured the same 3 rules Frank had taped above his own sink. Know who you're cooking for. Don't waste a crumb. Bake with memory. By the 10th anniversary of his passing, there were 22 Donovan kitchens across the country. Each one held a framed photo of Frank and a small loaf sculpture on display. Every April 18th, they held Bread and Valor Day. Veterans shared stories while community members broke bread together. No speeches, just stories, tears, and the comforting aroma of shared survival. One year, Jamal received an invitation to speak at a global food and peace summit in Geneva. Nervous but proud, he walked onto the stage wearing Frank's old apron, rescued from storage and carefully patched. The audience of diplomats and chefs quieted as he began. "I stand here not as a trained chef, but as a kid who once laughed at an old man kneading dough. I called him soft, useless. But Frank Donovan showed me that true power doesn't come from a gun or a podium. It comes from feeding the forgotten." He fought wars, but he baked peace. He fed battalions in combat and healed towns in peacetime, and all he ever wanted in return was to know someone else wouldn't go hungry. So today, in honor of him, I say this: put down your judgment. Pick up a loaf. Feed someone. You'll be amazed what rises. The crowd rose in applause. But Jamal didn't smile. Not then. He waited until backstage, where he clutched the apron to his chest, eyes brimming. Back home, the Hearth's kitchen wall had been expanded. On it now hung hundreds of framed photos, veterans in aprons, kids holding loaves, families reunited over dinner. At the center was a larger frame, the original group shot from the first shelter bake night. Frank in the middle, dusted in flour, smirking like he knew the joke before anyone else did. One day, a small boy entered the kitchen, trailing behind his mother. He looked up at Jamal, now in his 30s and running the Hearth full-time. Did Frank really bake bread in war? Jamal knelt beside him. He did. Even when he had nothing, even when he was scared. The boy thought for a second. Did it help? Jamal smiled. More than you know. The boy nodded. Then I want to learn. so I can help, too. Jamal handed him a tiny apron. As the oven ticked and dough rose once more, the hearth echoed with a truth long understood by everyone who ever passed through its doors. Heroes don't always wear armor. Sometimes they wear aprons, carry scars no one sees, and heal the world one loaf at a time. And long after Frank Donovan was gone, his hands kept baking through others, quietly, faithfully, feeding battalions, feeding hearts. That summer, the Smithsonian reached out with an official request. They wanted to feature Frank Donovan's story in a permanent exhibit titled Unsung Heroes of War. A small team arrived in town, documenting everything: his letters, his recipes, his dented baking tools, even the oil-stained notebook he'd carried through the desert, its pages filled with ingredient lists scribbled between combat notes. They interviewed veterans, students, shelter workers, and townsfolk. Everyone had a memory, a smile, a tear. One by one, the pieces of his life were gathered into a narrative not of glory, but of grace. On the day the exhibit opened, Jamal traveled to D.C. with Brian, Carly, and Susan. A replica of Frank's field oven stood in the center, surrounded by walls etched with stories of soldiers who had tasted hope in a crust of bread. A large photograph hovered above it all, Frank standing outside the shelter, arms crossed, sunlight hitting his face just right, flour smudged on his chin like war paint. During the unveiling, the curator stepped to the microphone. "We've honored generals, medics, engineers, but today, we honor a baker, not just for what he made, but for what he gave." Frank Donovan reminds us that in the worst of times, nourishment is resistance, compassion is courage. Jamal gave a short speech. He held up Frank's rolling pin, the same one Frank had used for decades. "This fed more people than some politicians ever could," he said, to scattered laughter. Then, more seriously, Frank taught us that survival isn't just breathing, it's breaking bread with someone who sees your pain and says, "Eat. You're not alone." Back home, the hearth expanded again. Now with a second floor, the loft of lessons, they called it. There, veteran bakers trained others, not just in kneading and rising, but in listening, grounding, and grieving. Therapy didn't always look like couches and clipboards. Sometimes it looked like 6 hands forming a braid in silence. One chilly autumn evening, a man arrived at the hearth, mid-50s, sunburned skin, lean frame. He had no bags, just a dog tag around his neck and a look in his eyes like he hadn't slept in years. Brian met him at the door. "Hungry?" he asked. The man nodded. "Ever bake?" The man shrugged. "Used to. In Iraq. Had a guy in my unit who taught me. Said food was the only thing stronger than fear." Brian smiled. "Then you've already met Frank Donovan?" The man blinked. "Wait. That Frank?" Brian handed him an apron. "Welcome home." That night, the man made honey rolls, sat at the long wooden table, shared his story, then slept in the upstairs bunk room for the first full night in years. Every now and then, a journalist or influencer would show up, chasing the legendary baker-soldier tale. They always expected heroics, drama, something viral. But what they found instead was something quieter and far more powerful. A warm kitchen, soft laughter, men and women who had seen things most people couldn't imagine, now shaping dough with kids who once knew only chaos. The reporters would ask, "What was Donovan really like?" And someone would always say, "He didn't talk much, but when he gave you bread, it felt like armor." Eventually, Donovan's Hearth launched a nationwide campaign, Bake Forward. Anyone, anywhere. Could download Frank's original recipes and bake loaves to donate to local shelters, hospitals, or families in need. Each loaf came with a printed tag that read, "In honor of Frank Donovan, who fed the hungry without asking why they were hungry." Tens of thousands of loaves were shared within the first year. Photos poured in, firemen holding trays, veterans hugging kids, refugees tasting their first piece of homemade bread in months. The world had taken Frank's fire and passed it on. One snowy Christmas Eve, Jamal stood outside the hearth, watching volunteers hand out bread under golden lights. An elderly woman approached, holding a steaming roll wrapped in cloth. "My grandson brought me this," she said. "Told me it would taste like love." He was right. Jamal smiled. "That's the Donovan effect." She nodded toward the hearth. "You all are keeping him alive." He looked up at the sign, now glowing brighter than ever. "No, he keeps us alive, inside." The ovens roared. Dough rose, people gathered. Not because of pity, not out of charity, but out of something deeper, something that had grown from Frank's hands, his scars, his silence, out of legacy. And if you ever visit that small town now, ask anyone where to find Donovan's hearth. They'll point you without hesitation. Step inside, and you'll feel it. The warmth, the history, the spirit of a man who once was teased for baking, until the world realized he had fed far more than battalions. He had fed humanity.